Tonight on Cross Currents, the tragedy of Tibet. It was once a forbidden land of peace and isolation. Today it lies crushed, devastated by years of slaughter and occupation by communist China. Why? Cross Currents with Jim Carney.
For years, centuries, the country of Tibet has symbolized remoteness, isolation, mystery, and spirituality. If there were one country on earth which should have escaped the ravages of the 20th century and been left in peace, surely it was Tibet. Well, the reality is that for much of this century, Tibet has been savaged by rebellion, foreign invasion, and occupation. In fact, an entire generation of Tibetans has known little but conflict, starvation, death, and exile. Only months after the establishment of the People's Republic of China in October 1949, the People's Liberation Army invaded Tibet. Tibet appealed to India, to Britain, to the fledgling United Nations. All politely declined to get involved. No one wanted to mess with the big new kid on the block, Communist China. To get some sense of the impact on Tibet of the Chinese occupation, let me give you a brief comparison between the two societies. Traditional Tibet was an hierarchical, highly conservative, feudal theocracy. In Tibetan Buddhism, virtually every aspect of life embodied the deeply held belief that attachment to worldly objects and pursuits only leads to suffering. The search for truth through spiritual practice and psychological introspection reveals the illusions of the mind that cause this suffering and ultimately brings release from it. The individual endeavors to transcend his limited human condition and achieve spiritual purity. Now, the ordinary Tibetan people had a deep understanding and acceptance of these concepts and revered the monks as their leaders and guides on the path to liberation. The Mao Zedong version of Marxism-Leninism, in stark contrast, posited a completely non-religious, classless, egalitarian society rooted in collective agricultural activity. It totally rejected the spiritual dimension of life and focused entirely on the state as a means of realizing earthly comfort. The new communist vision, therefore, required a complete dismantling of the traditional society, its structures, its attitudes, its values, and the elimination of all bourgeois influences. This meant anyone with a vested interest in the traditional society, from monks to teachers to farmers to businessmen. And there were also some immensely practical problems. The care and feeding of tens of thousands of Chinese troops became a crippling drain on Tibet's meager economy. Very soon, anti-Chinese rebellion broke out, especially in the northeast, resulting in the late 1950s in savage Chinese reprisals. Tens of thousands of Tibetans were slaughtered, often in hideous and barbaric ways. In 1959, as the conflict between the Chinese military forces and Tibetan rebels threatened to destroy Lhasa, the Dalai Lama, then 24 years of age, and a number of senior officials secretly left Lhasa to seek sanctuary in India, where they have lived ever since as a government in exile. In the early 60s, China increased her military strength in Tibet. She built several major roads from Lhasa to the frontiers using forced Tibetan labor. Thousands of Tibetans were sent to labor camps near Mongolia. Tibetan crops were expropriated to feed the army and to provide food for China, where famine raged. As their own agricultural products were trucked off to China, Tibetan peasants were reported to be using their own blood to nourish their children and picking through horse droppings looking for undigested grain. But the worst was still to come. Probably nothing before or since devastated Tibet as much as China's Cultural Revolution, which began in 1966. Groups of young Red Guards, many of them Tibetans, went on a rampage through Tibetan towns and villages, beating and terrorizing, inflicting bizarre forms of torture and death on tens of thousands, including women and children. The Red Guard's manifesto proclaimed that they were, quote, lawless revolutionary rebels who would wield the iron sweepers and swing the mighty cudgels to sweep the old world into a mess and bash people into complete confusion, unquote. And bash they did. A priceless heritage of religious structures and artifacts was virtually wiped off the face of the earth. Of some 6,254 monasteries in Tibet, only a few dozen were left standing, while their contents were trucked off to China, much of it ending up in the antique shops of Hong Kong and Singapore. Then, nature herself seemed to turn on Tibet. The worst drought in 100 years was followed by the heaviest snowfall in half a century. In 1968, another famine began, which would last 6 years. In 1972, a catastrophic earthquake struck. It is difficult to watch the film tonight without a sense of anger, outrage, and frustration. Time has not improved conditions for the people of Tibet. Yet, after all, what can be done? Is anybody going to go to war with China over Tibet? Not likely.
I think one major problem about the question of Tibet is that the world does not know enough about it. To start with, they have this wrong notion that it is a tiny country tucked away somewhere in the middle of the Himalayas. That is not true. Tibet is a vast country, almost as large as Western Europe, 9 times the size of the United Kingdom, 2/3 the size of India. Tibet today, in fact, is 25% of present-day China, bigger than the continent of Australia.
To enter Tibet as a tourist is to be captivated by the mystical world of Tibetan Buddhism. The exotic temples of this ancient civilization dominate the people and the landscape. A gentle and devout race follow a path of peace 2,000 years old. But according to Tibetans who have fled the country, these images disguise the real story. They claim that one is witnessing the last days of a disappearing world.
Six million Jews were massacred during the Second World War. The world has been constantly reminded about this, and I think rightly so. But 1.2 million Tibetans, the last surviving ancient civilization on earth, preserved and intact until 30 years ago. This is the tragedy. And now, facing extinction, 6,000 monasteries wiped out, 1.2 million people massacred, and these things still continuing inside Tibet.
I think there is uneasy peace at the moment. But on the one hand, the Chinese resentment, their opposition, unhappiness because of the Chinese occupation is very strong. And on the other hand, the Chinese have taken very strong measures to suppress Tibetan resistance movements.
Tibetans faced extinction, annihilation, and who is saying anything about it? You are interviewing me here in India. You can't go into Tibet.
To investigate their claims, I entered Tibet and traveled for 5.5 weeks undercover. Finding evidence of the charges is not easy. The country is strictly controlled by the Chinese, and foreigners are only allowed into a handful of towns in closely supervised groups. All individual travel is forbidden. I traveled over 6,000 kilometers throughout Tibet. Sometimes I posed as a tourist, but for most of the journey, disguised as a Tibetan, I was hidden inside a vehicle driven by friendly Tibetans. Tibet, as Tibetans see it, is more than just a mere province of China. They say that what is now called Qinghai, as well as territories in other adjacent provinces, belongs to Tibet under treaties going back 1,200 years. The reality, as I found traveling throughout the area, is that everything is controlled by the Chinese, and that the so-called Tibetan Autonomous Region is simply run by an administration appointed in Beijing. The majority of Tibet was taken after the Communist Chinese army invaded in 1949. The Tibetans, with their antiquated rifles, were no match for Chinese artillery. The Chinese say that they came to liberate Tibet from feudalism, but Tibetans allege their policy was to exterminate all Tibetan opposition. This man, a monk, was one of the few who survived.
I saw many people die in front of me. Many died around me, many close by. I'm left over from death. Dead prisoners are buried in the sand. They are still there in the sand today.
He told me that thousands of Tibetans were imprisoned by the Chinese for resisting their efforts to subdue the Tibetan people. He said that hundreds of thousands died. Only 1% of those who had been imprisoned survived, and what they often died of was hunger.
Over 1 million people died of starvation. We were so hungry we picked cabbages and other bits of vegetable out of human excrement and then ate them. Other prisoners I know had to eat abra, rats and dogs. We even ate meat from human corpses. Whatever one gets, one eats. I ate human flesh myself. I had to survive. We would crush the legs and bones of prisoners who had died and drink the juice. It offered some nourishment and gave our own bodies strength. It was very helpful in that way, and at least allowed one to get a night's sleep without the pain of hunger.
The Tibetans whose suffering affected the whole nation were the farmers. Until the Chinese arrived, famine was completely unknown in Tibet, though their methods were old-fashioned. The Chinese introduced collectivization and methods of agriculture totally unsuited for Tibet. For instance, they insisted that wheat, which is unsuited to high altitudes, was planted instead of the traditional barley. The resulting catastrophic famine in 1959 to 62 devastated the country, and tens of thousands of Tibetans died. With the agricultural policy in shambles, the Chinese somewhat relaxed their rigid control over Tibetan agriculture. But despite changes in some of the rules and a degree of free market economy, Tibet still suffers from acute shortages, and malnutrition has become endemic. Tibetans also complain that the Chinese have evicted them from their fertile valleys and sent them up to the arid mountains where they scratch a meager living as drogpa, or landless nomads. Most farmers were too frightened to talk. Tibetans under pain of imprisonment are forbidden to criticize Chinese policy, especially to foreigners. But this man agreed, provided we disguised his appearance and his voice.
When the Chinese first came in 1949, they gave the farmers tools and said they have come to help us. But 4 years later, they had taken control of everything themselves, and there was no room for the Tibetans. The Chinese took over our homes, they took over our fields, everything, and pushed the Tibetans to the outskirts. My family is an example. 2 jumped in the water and committed suicide. 1 died in prison. 1 hanged himself. As a farmer, all my lands were taken away. I had no means of survival. I thought I would die. These events should never happen to any human beings. I was completely devastated by this.
Traveling has never been easy in Tibet. Away from the few tourist roads around Lhasa and the main army supply routes from China, roads are scarce. Deep in the countryside, the terrain becomes almost impassable. Here, 18,000 feet up the Yela mountain, we literally ran out of track and had to hack and push our way over the pass. For Tibetans, traveling holds additional problems. Even to visit relations in a nearby village, they have to get official permission from the Chinese, and that's not always granted. And if Tibetans travel without permits and are caught at the frequent and random road checks, they're heavily fined. Driving east and halfway between Lhasa and the Chinese border, we arrived at Chamdo, the third largest city in Tibet. Once an important Tibetan administrative center, it is now almost entirely Chinese, with a tiny Tibetan ghetto. As it's also a military headquarters, it was almost impossible to film, as detection would have meant certain arrest and detention. Tibetans said that even in towns like this, malnutrition has become a very serious problem. So I asked a doctor how the Chinese administration had affected Tibetans' health.
In old Tibet, we did not have much medical care. That is true. And the Chinese claim they have improved the standards of health and medical treatment. But in fact, there has been an increase in the number of Tibetans who are sick, and an increase in the number of different diseases people get. I will give you an example. Because of malnutrition, there are now a lot of diseases related to the lungs. 50 to 60% of the population suffers from this. And it is not just lung diseases. Tibetans suffer from heart and blood complaints, as one would expect. But more people are getting them now than before the Chinese came. And we are even getting diseases in Tibet now that simply didn't exist before Chinese came, like consistent coughing, which you call tuberculosis.
These charges are echoed by what the farmer had told me a few days before.
You please make a thorough investigation of the actual living conditions of Tibetans in their own country. Look at how many houses have been constructed in Tibet, built by the Chinese for the Chinese. They bring their people into Tibet in large numbers to live here. Moreover, they say they have built roads for us all around here. But these roads are the roads they use to carry all the natural resources and mineral wealth of Tibet back to China. Hundreds of trucks each day.
The number of trucks carrying logs increased as we traveled east. Tibetans in exile calculate that in over 30 years, China has earned $54 billion from the export of Tibetan timber.
You know, today Tibet is the largest forest reserve for China. If you come traveling across China into Tibet, you will see the rivers flooded with logs floating down into China. Vast tracts of forests, you know, completely destroyed. I've heard of places where there are 20, 30,000 people felling trees.
As we drove deep into the picturesque mountains of eastern Carney, we met Tibetans acutely concerned by the rampant deforestation.
The Chinese don't just cut down a few trees. Since 1963, they have been cutting down trees 24 hours a day and transporting them back to China by road and river. The world doesn't know it, but I know because I've seen it.
He said that forests like this one had once covered all of eastern Kham, but now most of the hillsides were scarred by deforestation. You could see the mutilated trees and barren hillsides everywhere, and no visible sign of a replanting policy. He said that wildlife had been badly affected also. Before, we had great herds of gazelles, he said, wild ass, bar-headed geese, Brahmani ducks. Now, nothing.
As a result of the deforestation, the soil has degenerated and has become like this. That means the grass won't grow and the animals get no food.
They have carried out unhindered exploitation in the destruction of Tibet's large forest reserves. And this has threatened the fragile ecology of Tibet. Wildlife have disappeared. There's been wide-scale flooding, landslides, which have affected not only Tibet, but even inside China and Burma and parts of India, because, you know, all the major rivers of Asia flow from Tibet. And this is a concern not only for 6 million Tibetans, it concerns millions of people all over the world.
It's not just timber, Tibetans told me, that the Chinese are now removing, but also Tibet's vast mineral reserves. The Chinese call Tibet the Western Treasure House, and with good reason. Tibet is rich in a wide variety of largely untapped minerals, including uranium, oil, coal, copper, and gold. Through the pass near Darsi, though, where the invading Chinese armies swarmed west in February 1950, Chinese trucks now trundle east, carrying what Tibetans see as their patrimony. Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan in China proper, was the furthest east I travelled. The sheer number of people is a stark contrast to the empty spaces of Tibet, and you can immediately see why the Chinese are hungry for more land to solve their bursting population problem. Already over the billion mark, the population of China is expected to grow by another 200 million in the next 10 years. I was now about halfway along the route through Tibetan and Chinese territory that I had planned at the start. Along the road from Chengdu to Xining, in a completely Chinese area closed to foreigners, I was stopped by the authorities. They discovered that I had no permit to be traveling in the area, and I had to stop filming immediately. After some discussion, they accepted my argument that I was a tourist separated from my group and politely sent me, under escort, direct to Xining. Xining, once the capital of the Tibetan province of Amdo, used to be Tibet's official northeast frontier with China. In 1949, it was the site of the main invasion by the Chinese Second Field Army. Today, Xining is almost a totally Chinese city. It is this overwhelming Chinese presence that Tibetans fear will soon dominate their own country. Nearly everyone you see is Chinese, and the odd Tibetan in the street reminded me of the fate of the Australian Aborigines, reduced to a tourist curiosity in their own land. We drove west towards the Changthan, Tibet's vast empty quarter. This ancient Tibetan oasis was once a staging post for the Mongol hordes of Kublai Khan as they swept across Tibet and China 700 years ago. The center of Kublai Khan's empire was China, and that's one reason why the modern Chinese claim that these deserts are an integral part of China. But Tibetans point out that the same Kublai Khan was a Buddhist, and in 1254 gave both temporal and spiritual power back to the Tibetans. Two-thirds of the Tibetan population is nomad, and herdsmen told me that before the Chinese invasion they owned about 100 head of cattle per family. Now their herds are dramatically reduced, and they have to give a large percentage of their produce to the state. The Chinese claim that it's to help pay for the education and medical treatment which is available to every Tibetan. But the nomads told me they don't see any such benefits. Today, the oasis is under Chinese supervision, and it's this gradual Sinification of the country that the Tibetans most resent.
The most dangerous development has been this large number of Chinese coming into Tibet. There has been, in the last 8-9 years, a tremendous increase in Chinese in Tibet. So, in real terms, the Tibetans, they feel the threat of the unemployment because of the Chinese presence.
Tibetans fear the extinction of their race, not only from the flood of Chinese immigrants, but because they claim that their own birth rate is being vigorously controlled. Many said Tibetan women had been subjected to compulsory abortions. I asked the doctor if the allegations were true.
That is correct. In the past, the Chinese have said that they don't place great value on more human beings, and they have therefore enforced throughout China a rule that no family should have more than 2 children. If you do have more than 2 children, there are economic penalties as well as political repercussions.
Another man confirmed the allegations and spoke of his personal experience.
In the villages, there is a restriction on childbirth. Women are forced to undergo sterilization. My wife, for example, we have got 2 children, and she has been sterilized. If the Chinese want to impose a policy like this on their own people, that is okay, because they have a huge population, a larger population, in fact, than any country in the world. But for us Tibetans, it's quite different. We have a vast amount of land, but only a small population.
Forced abortions are said to be performed at this hospital in Chamdo. Several women told me of terminations at 3 and 5 months, and a few even later. Others recounted how at childbirth they were anesthetized and woke up to find that they had also been sterilized. I asked the doctor how it was possible for anyone, let alone a government, to force a woman to have an abortion.
Although on the face of it, the Chinese do not force anyone not to have children, they do in effect make it compulsory by imposing economic and political sanctions against people who do have too many children.
But doctor, with respect, how do I know that you're actually telling me the truth?
True, you hardly believe all this, but that is because foreigners aren't allowed into the interior of Tibet. So if you don't believe me, go and visit some of these places. Go to the villages, the hospital, anywhere, and ask. If you ask the people, you will find out.
Tibetans are a profoundly devout people, and before the Chinese invasion were the most religious nation on earth. There were over 6,000 monasteries, and a quarter of its population were monks. Its ancient monastic universities were the centers of a highly developed liturgy and literature. And the monks were also guardians of Tibet's priceless artistic heritage, stretching back 2,000 years. Much of this heritage has been smashed by the Chinese. Some monasteries suffered during the original occupation, and more damage was inflicted during the Cultural Revolution. Sacred objects were desecrated, statues either melted into bullion or sold for foreign exchange, and 60% of Tibet's literature was burned. The practice of religion was proscribed, monks were evicted from their monasteries, and thousands were imprisoned and tortured. The horror of those days is still painfully remembered today.
They put knives to our throats and stuck knives in the prisoners' testicles. Those who were castrated in this way didn't die easily, nor did the ones whose throats had been slit. And there were lots of cases like this. The years 1976 to 77 were very difficult for me. I wouldn't have believed it possible for human beings to be treated in this way. It was like hell on earth. You would wake in the morning to find maybe a dozen people had died during the night. The Chinese dug huge ditches, 2 huge ditches, which were piled up with bodies until they overflowed. They put a thin layer of soil over them, and we were made to walk on the bodies. One would see legs, arms, heads sticking out from various angles. One wouldn't want to look at it, but one's eye would drawn towards the side even though one was scared to look. 1 or 2 people would not dare to walk past the ditches on their own. But this is not fiction. This really happened. Between 1976 and 77, many people were killed by the Chinese. I knew some of them myself. People like Dangar Chunso, Punso Pusang, Kacholta were even driven to killing themselves. Many people did that, committing suicide by drowning themselves.
There was clear evidence there was systematic destruction of Tibetan culture, there was genocide committed in Tibet. And then the United Nations, they adopted 3 resolutions in 1959, 61, and 65, condemning China for violation of human rights, including the right to self-determination.
Tibet occupies the strategic heartland of Asia, and the Chinese deploy over 250,000 troops there. They've built airfields, radar stations, and military roads, especially in the sensitive border areas near India. They've now organized high-altitude rapid deployment forces, and recently, a newspaper reported chemical warfare exercises taking place in Tibet. This convoy of military trucks appeared to be coming from an area that I had been told was an important military center. Nachuka, 320 kilometers northeast of Lhasa, is, according to informed sources, the site of a Chinese nuclear missile base. When we got there seemed to be little sign of activity, though people we met said it had been full of soldiers the night before. The missile base is supposed to be in the hills outside the town. It was difficult to get hard evidence, but 2 Tibetans I met explained what they knew. And although they were prepared to speak to us undisguised, we decided that identifying them would not add to the credibility of their story.
Yes, there is a top-secret area, and this is it. For that reason, one isn't allowed to go into this area. But many people have heard noises and seen things moving around. Many people have seen missiles with Chinese markings.
I asked them again if there was any hard evidence about the nuclear missile base.
Many Tibetan nomads have seen missiles movement at different places, but the basic evidence is simply that it is so secret and so heavily guarded by the military.
It is known through various independent reports that China has placed perhaps a quarter of their nuclear arsenal inside Tibet, estimated to range into some 70 ICBMs. These are targeted against Russia, against major industrial and population centers in India, and they could even reach other countries in Southeast Asia, perhaps as far as Guam. Tibet's high altitude, an average of no less than 14,000 feet above sea level, gives them an added advantage. So there's so many reasons why China is so adamant about holding on to Tibet.
There's no mistaking the Chinese presence in towns like Lhasa. The Chinese have taken over most traditional Tibetan jobs, tailoring and shoemaking, for instance, as well as running most of the shops and small restaurants. Even the people who sell offertory scarves to visitors to Tibet's holiest shrine are Chinese. They come mainly from Sichuan, 1,000 miles to the east, encouraged by special allowances and deals, which means that they can earn up to 2 or 3 times as much in Tibet as they can back home. By contrast, unemployment among Tibetans is running at about 70% in Lhasa. Tibetans have one of the lowest income per capita in the world, and many Tibetans are reduced to begging and scrounging off foreign tourists. Tibetans accuse the Chinese of racism and operating, in effect, a system of apartheid. The Chinese live in segregated compounds, in subsidized housing with electricity, running water and sewage. Tibetans largely huddle in overcrowded slums with no basic amenities. Chinese is now the official language, and Chinese posters dominate the streets. Although Tibetan has recently been reintroduced to schools, the main language of education is Chinese, and many Tibetan children can scarcely write in their mother tongue. Another legacy of the Cultural Revolution is a fear of informers who report to the Chinese authorities any signs of opposition or dissent. Amnesty International say that 150 people are now being held incommunicado for political offences. I was unable to check that, though I did find that many people were very frightened.
The people of Tibet have been herded like animals for so long by the Chinese occupation forces that there is a general fear against saying out loud what is really in their minds. The Chinese have spies everywhere, among the monks, ordinary people, office workers. In fact, there is a spy on almost every street corner.
8 years ago, the Chinese introduced economic and social reforms, which allowed the monks to begin rebuilding some of their monasteries. Tibetans can now openly worship, but claim that the changes are largely cosmetic, designed more to encourage tourism than revive Tibetan culture. Traditionally, the monasteries were more than just places of prayer. They were centers of education and ideas to which all the population could aspire. Now, all recruits have to be over 18. Anyone younger is denied residential and food permits. All candidates must get Chinese security clearance. And it's also said that some Chinese-appointed abbots do not even hold religious vows. Despite these restrictions, the monks struggle to keep alive their language and literature. Because they have become the guardians of Tibetan identity, the monks now hold a unique position in Tibetan life and are seen as the focus of what resistance there is to the Chinese occupation. Years of frustration erupted in Lhasa last year, when monks led a demonstration against the Chinese, demanding the release of an imprisoned colleague and asking for independence. The Chinese police used rough tactics to break up the demonstration, and in the violence that ensued, 6 Tibetans were killed and hundreds imprisoned. These young nuns were arrested and tortured after another demonstration this March. They are not agitators, they are unsophisticated country girls. Lhasa, on the first anniversary of the riots, tension was high. The army was patrolling in intimidating numbers, clearly determined to suppress any trouble. But Tibetans were calm. Non-violence and stoic patience are the central tenets of their faith. This is the building where the man who most personifies these beliefs should be living, the Potala or Celestial Palace of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet. It was 39 years ago that he escaped from the Chinese and sought refuge in India. And today he represents every Tibetan's hope for an independent homeland. This summer he put forward a 5-point peace plan to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Although the Dalai Lama accepts that his people are in a desperate plight, he still wants to negotiate with the Chinese. And their discussions are scheduled for January.
You see, this is the worst period in our 2,000 years history. This is the really, you see, the very, very serious, how to say, period. The time or the period, there is every danger, entire Tibetan nation with their own unique cultural heritage completely disappear. If present situation remain, within short period, Tibetan will be minority in our own country.
In his 5-point plan, the Dalai Lama offered a temporary compromise. While demanding the removal of all nuclear weapons and nuclear testing from Tibet, thereby declaring Tibet a zone of peace, he was prepared to concede responsibility for defense and foreign affairs to the Chinese. Some Tibetans immediately accused him of surrendering their claim to independence. But the Dalai Lama says that practical autonomy must come first. Otherwise, their very survival is threatened.
The question of independence now simply, you see, not realistic. You see, the present situation is more seriously. That is really a question of life and death.
Why?
If death occur, then nothing left. So much is destruction about Tibetan culture, Tibetan way of life already happened. Now the community themselves, now you see there's great threat to eliminate or to assimilate and large flux of Chinese settler.
For the Dalai Lama, the preservation of a people and a unique culture is all important. Political control of frontiers is perforce secondary. But that's not good enough for many militant Tibetans in exile. They plan to take action.
Immediately, we don't plan or foresee a guerrilla movement as we had in the past. It's going to be sabotage tactics, other things which I cannot discuss at this moment. We have a number of things on our mind. But I think ultimately we believe our future will depend on two things. Our ability to control the situation inside Tibet. What we want to do is to keep it destabilized. We are not going to beg for help anymore. We are going to force people to be involved inside Tibet because they will have no choice.
Mr. Sering, how realistic is it to talk about a guerrilla war with your limited resources when the Chinese have more than 250,000 men in Tibet?
I don't plan to smash all of China. I don't want to do a murder where the body is totally unrecognizable, but I will blind the eye, a prick in the heart, pinpoint attacks at strategic positions where it will hurt most.
But Mr. Sering, isn't this a pipe dream?
Well, for one, I fight not because I have any guarantees of success, insurance against failure. I fight because I must. It is my birthright. Secondly, I fight because what is going on inside Tibet is wrong. Ultimately, I'm not a businessman. You know, we have been brought up upholding certain values. One of them being, it is nobler, better to die on one's feet than to live on one's knees.
Brave words in face of massive Chinese army presence in Tibet, and sentiments which the Dalai Lama does not support.
So you see, let us find some other, you see, new way or new method. I call, you see, middle way. And the Chinese can keep their limited military forces for the time being till this is some kind of genuine guarantee for peace. Then, you see, Tibet eventually, is my dream, is Tibet should be a zone of non-violence.
And if they come forward with a reasonable, open-minded approach, if they are willing to discuss all the issues, then we hope that we will be able to find a solution.
So what
but on the other hand, if the Chinese say that there's no problem in Tibet, and the problem is the return of the Dalai Lama and few refugees, then of course the situation in Tibet, both in and outside Tibet, would take a much more violent turn. And certainly I think then there will be a lot of bloodshed.
When I left Lhasa a few weeks ago, it was under tight military control. It had been impossible to check every allegation that had been made to me by the Tibetans I met. But there did seem enough in what they said to justify sending an independent fact-finding mission to Tibet as a matter of urgency. But perhaps the most convincing evidence is the courage of the people who talk to me. Each of them risks arrest, imprisonment, and possible death. But they put their country first, wanting the world to know what is happening, to its afflicted people.
Why have they done this?
If it is going to do some good for the people of Tibet, then I have no regrets for what I have done here or what I have said to you. And I don't fear the consequences, even if it means death. The whole Tibetan people is being suppressed by the Chinese. We have no real power, no educational skills. So if the world doesn't help, there is little hope for us. If I die in prison, it is for Tibet. If I survive in prison, it is for Tibet. I have no regrets if I die on the way to Tibetan independence.
The issue of Tibet is often clouded by the question of whether it is an independent sovereign nation or part of China. China, of course, maintains that Tibet is part of China, and therefore any intervention by any other country is an illegal interference in China's internal affairs. Some Western experts point out that no contemporary Western government has ever formally recognized Tibet as an independent country. However, a large body of expert opinion in the West maintains that under most criteria of international law, Tibet has established its status as an independent and sovereign nation, thus making the Chinese occupation illegal. In any case, many legal experts agree that regardless of any historical relationship, the overriding principle of self-determination should prevail. Next week on Cross Currents, another story of what happens to small countries caught between big ones. A very Polish secret tells the story of the massacre of members of the Polish Home Army, the anti-German resistance, by the Russians a few months after the end of World War II. What makes this one of the worst atrocities of that war was that the Poles had fought alongside the Russians as their allies in freeing their homeland from German occupation. It was also one of the best-kept secrets of that war and would have remained secret without the courage of the people of the village of Augustov, where the massacre took place. They decided after 43 years to tell their story. Here's a preview.
In the towns, they were kept in police stations, but when they quickly filled, private houses were requisitioned. In the villages like Gibe, they were herded into barns and pigsties and interrogated. Not just about the Home Army, but also to piece together the political network behind it.
No a na górze, tam co oni ich badali, to takie 6 iglicy leżały na stole. To oni za paznokcie im sadzali. To w drzwi ręce sadzali, przyciśniętego drzwiami, a to za paznokcie sadzali.
Bili ich, katowali. Nie daj Boże, co oni z nimi robili tam.
I ściany, wszystko było we krwi w tym mieszkaniu.
Ja widziałam, jakiego prowadzili. I stałam jeszcze tak za siatką, patrzyłam i serce mnie bolało strasznie. I na tym się skończyło. I 27, proszę pana, 27 ich nocą wywieźli.
The Polish authorities enlisted a local team of volunteers who began a full-scale exhumation. An initial ditch was dug, exposing 10 skeletons. Then a second ditch was started, but after 4 more bodies were discovered, the authorities abruptly halted the digging. The truth, however, cannot be buried so easily.
A very Polish secret, the Russian atrocity near the village of Augustov in Poland in 1945. Next week on Cross Currents. Don't forget, if you want to know any more about any of the subjects in the Cross Currents series, more detail, more background, something to help you remember what the film was about, I've written viewer's guides with more of the political and historical background for many of these programs. There's one for tonight's program, Tibet, A Case to Answer. For Cross Currents, I'm Jim Carney. Good night.
Viewer's guides for each program in the Cross Currents series are available at a cost of $3 each or $25 for the full set of 10. You can obtain your guides by writing to The Knowledge Bookstore, Post Office Box 94,000, Richmond, BC, V6Y2A2. If you prefer, you can phone the bookstore at one of these numbers, 660-2190, or toll-free 1-800-663-9711. And you can charge the order to your Visa or MasterCard. Once again, the cost of these informative guides is $3 each or $25 for the set of 10. Order yours now.